Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. First of all, it's a pleasure to be back at the University of Lausanne. I miss the schoolrooms, although this building was not there when I was here. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give something back to the university where I had a chance to study and spend quite some good time and have a lot of fun as well. Now, I usually tend not to follow too much the instructions when they tell me what I have to speak about. But I did have to somehow study or decide what I'm going to talk about. They say the future of sport. And then they were trying to nail me down on some specific points. I say, how do you know what the future of sports will hold? And I have no clue. So I discovered that whoever studies this is called a futurist or a futurologist. So I found like a little bit being a magician. I thought I could bring some kind of crystal ball, but that was a little bit too big. And but I'm glad that among the many titles that you've kindly listed, I can now add the title of futurist. That's an interesting one. Now, but when you move and want to talk about the future, I think there is nothing less than also, first of all, having a look back and trying to understand where we stand and why we're actually here and why we're talking. We're always interested in the future, of course, because we like to be hopeful and hope that the future will always be better than the present and than the past. So the first thing that I'd like to do is to go a little bit back in time. Now, we're based in Europe, and not every one of you I see comes from Europe, but obviously the sports movement in itself has a lot of roots in terms of its organization in Europe. So I apologize if somehow I'm maybe a little bit European-centric on that particular topic. And of course, here and there I'll hint to the fact that it's not just about Europe, of course, and cultures are very diverse from wherever you are. And when you are leading or somehow sitting in a seat where a lot of countries come together, whether it's the United Nations Security Council or the Central Board of FIBA or the Executive Committee of the IOC, it's a lot of cultures that come together and a lot of different ways of looking at the values of sport and a lot of different ways of acting and of managing sport organizations. And so when we look back at where sports came from, at least in the form that we know it today, it's been a long series of actions and reactions. Many times reactions, so some may argue that that's never good, you should be proactive, but life is not always that simple, and you can't predict everything because we're, after all, not really magicians and just simply human. In the early 20th century, the modern Olympic Games were brought back to life, as you know, by Pierre de Coubertin, and following that in a kind of almost very fast after that, with the first international federation, like the gymnastics one or others, they came, and in the first 30 years of the 20th century, all the international federations started to be created. A lot of history there. I'm not going to delve in that, but that's been a crucial moment in terms of what we have today. So somehow almost 100 years old structure, if not even more, for some of the sports and certainly for the Olympic Games. Now, I'm not talking about the ancient Olympic Games because that's obviously an idea that goes back thousands of years. Now, if we just fast forward, we go the next step. We have an important piece in the governance of sport where before was organized by itself, by the people. They organized themselves in associations. They came together. They handed out decisions to their members. Well, sometimes they felt that maybe not exactly well done, and therefore the IOC pushed for the creation of the Court of Arbitration for Sports in the 80s already. But it is only about 10 years later, when ICAS was formed in Paris in 1994, that somehow the Court of Arbitration for Sport became an integral part of every statutes of an international federations and theoretically of every National Olympic Committee as well. 4 years later, cycling doping scandal, result, WADA was created. A year later, we have the bribery scandal around the Salt Lake City Olympic Games. We have the IOC 2000 Commission, which then has changed the whole governance of the IOC in terms of term limits for IOC membership, age limits, and also in how the governing bodies are functioning within the IOC. Then let's move another 10 years forward, and before even the scandals in 15 and 16, the IOC and the new president decided that, well, maybe it might be good to be more proactive than reactive. And so in 2014, the IOC Agenda 2020 was put in place. That was not the result of a scandal or of anything. It was just simply a thought that might be better to change yourself than be changed by others. And we'll see throughout the presentation that that's pretty much a common sense normally, but not always something that we live by the day. 2015, we all know, doping scandal in the IAAF with Russia, the issue with FIFA, and as a consequence, the Summer Olympic International Federation have created the governance task force and worked on principles of good governance among all the international federations. And later on, 2016, and this is still an ongoing matter, the Russian doping scandal, where has led the WADA to create a CRC, or a Code Compliance Committee, and the IOC, the International Testing Agencies, the ITA. So somehow, as you see, actions and reactions, but when you come together and when you look then at the list of what our good friend Callum will be talking later, what people really like to talk about is this. That's something where everybody has a lot of fun, and probably not those that are involved, but it seems to be something that is quite easy to sell and nice to read, and leads then to maybe Sion losing the vote on this upcoming Sunday. But when you really look properly, and you're not just involved in sports, we do have also this. Ads doesn't create that many waves. That's curious, but it exists too. And what I'm trying to say here is that somehow sport is not immune from the rest of the world. We're not outside the Earth. We're not somewhere in the galactic interspace and can do what we want. We are humans. We live in a society. We're citizens. We have passports. We abide by the laws, or at least we try. And we reflect, or we are a mirror of what's happening in the society. Sometimes it's a little bit more exaggerated because there's a lot of emotions in sports, and it creates more headline than if you have an accountant in Parmalat that changes the accounts. That's not really a headline, but if you have the team that is sponsored by Parmalat that is creating a problem or is buying the result because its striker is not shooting so well the penalty, well, that creates a huge headline. And so I'm trying just simply to say is that sport mirrors and reflects the society, therefore it reflects also its virtues and its vices. Now, when you look into the future, I think first you have to go back. We've seen a bit of piece of that. Then I think we need to understand the context in which we live. That changes from decade to decade, from year to year, even almost from day to day. And then we need also to understand how we are organized and how we function. Now, if I look at just simply, briefly, the broader context, that's actually, I don't even need this. It's fun to. And we look at the broader context on where we are in terms of just in the society in which we live. I think there's a very clear geopolitical trend, which is quite common and now a very normal state of the affair. You just enough to look at the media from an international perspective, maybe less if you're in Switzerland and you look at our own media. You don't see it that much, but if you look in the German media, in the Italian media, in the United States, in France, it is obvious that we are in an environment where they are the citizens, the normal people. I mean, we're somehow kind of disillusioned with what's happening, and we shout, we complain, we criticize, and we do this more and more in a more and more vocal way, and we try to overturn in some places here and there governments, parties, and things just because we think that a change is necessary. And most of the time, we're certainly also very much right. And that is something that is a clear sign of today's society. And when you look at it, it does feel quite similar when you just look at the sports movement as well. It's a global phenomenon. There's criticism. It's in many cases, of course, a very well-deserved criticism. It is amplified by the current kind of, here it says, the symbiotic relationship with the new media landscape, where social media and all makes it possible for everyone to speak at every moment and have an immediate circulation of that news and of that point of view and of across the globe. And it does affect opinions, and it allows for change. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's good. I think it's a necessary thing. It's something that happens, and I think it's something that we have simply to deal with, and it's something that exists also in sport in some way. Now, when you look at the economic side of it, just simply on a big picture stroke, and we are here in Europe, but if we really look at it, we see this also in sport. It's obvious that the global economic power is shifting extremely rapidly to Asia. If you look at the millennials, or we have the generation Y, the generation Z, the millennials, and we can go through the sociology studies. But if you look at the millennials today, 86% of the millennials of today come from emerging and developing countries. And in 20 years from now, they will be running the world. And if they stay where they are, well, it's not the US, it's not us, Europe, it's they that will be running the world and will be having the resources and the revenues to do what they think is best in their opinion, to support sport, not to support sports, or to do other things as they feel it is appropriate for the growth of themselves, for their families, and of course, for their countries where they come from. Now, when you look at you go a little bit, you narrow it a little bit down, and you go to sport. We're in a constant evolution, and sometimes we tend to forget that. We are much easier criticizing how bad things are today, but in fact, sport over the 100 years that it has existed has been constantly evolving. Now, of course, in the very first years of this 20th century until recently, it's been all about mainly technology changes, rule adaptations, and things like this. Of course, since the ICAS is there, we've all, as International Federation, changed our rules, we've adjusted them, because we don't want to be blamed by an outside court that we've done something wrong. If we can do it right, let's do the rules right. And at the same time, technology has caught up, and you have here a number of examples of things that have happened over the last 60, 70 years, and I miss a few that I have not done because they come very straight from the United States, and we're all maybe slightly less familiar with what happens there. But I believe that all of these somehow are extremely well known by all of you here in the house, whether you are a skier, whether you look tennis, now Roland Garros, and you see the Hawkeye, whether you happen to run, although even there we already have some news on how Nike is looking at the certain new shoes, if you have just read the very recent articles on it, or if you're a football fan, of course you understand what the goal line technology is, and if you're a Swiss, you understand that it was there even before it was in football, because we do have hockey and we know how a puck has to go through that goal. Now, some have stayed, some have gone. Swimsuits were there, but eventually they obviously left because they gave an unfair advantage to the athletes, according to FIBA. Now, that's what has happened so far. Now, of course, in the recent years, we've been focusing more on other things, but before that, I think it's equally interesting to look a little bit at sports trends from a business perspective, or from the industry. What does the industry say? What is changing there? And here you have a few analyses. If you try to Google it, it can take you a week. And I can tell you, after the past 10 days, I've read so much about the future that I still don't understand what's going to happen, first of all. But I do start to understand that AR is augmented reality and VR is virtual reality. Now, I even understand what the difference is in both of them. And I understand that in 20 years from now, there won't be any difference anymore between the two. Now, I even read that somehow down the line, 20, 50 years from now, we won't be doing sports. Some robots will do, some bionic men will do. I hope I won't see that, and I hope my kids won't. But that's what some of those futurologists are currently writing in blogs or in other kind of articles. But here there are some bits and pieces that you can see about whether it's trend setting, whether it's disruptive, that you already see that they have been taken over by some of the sports governing bodies, whether it is the Olympic channel that the IOC has put in place, whether it's us having put in place the 3-on-3, or other forms of sport, as was mentioned before by Emmanuel, or how coaching has been improved because of all the data that now is available, and how your broadcasting is getting better, and how the stadium is now connected virally, and you can look at more data than just the players that are there or the athletes that are there with its own performance. I think many of these that are mentioned here are already quite present and already existing, and they're not so futuristic as some of these things may see. Now, obviously, when you, one of the most, not key one, but certainly one of the most trendy one these days is trying to argue what is esport versus sport. Now, there's a lot of debate around it. There's going to be also an open day in July led by GAISF and the IOC here in Lausanne to have a public debate that will be streamed, and then with some specialists. But it is an interesting debate because the technology going so fast, this augmented reality and virtual reality merging with the real sports, and the fact that finally, whether we like it or not, there's a lot of this youth that is just simply there and likes gaming one way or another. It is affecting sport, and it is affecting our future definition of sport. Now, today we don't know, is esports sport or it's not? There's arguments, yes and no. If you look at a shooter, as an example, he's using a shooter in shooting, I think, or an archer in archery, which is an Olympic discipline. The way they use the muscles in their hands is not dissimilar to the way you're using a joystick. The fact that a surgery, if you are a surgeon or you're doing your medical school and you want to become a surgeon or a heart surgeon, the fact that you may be or not gaming can be quite influential in making you a better surgeon or not. So there's a lot of issues there that can come up, a lot of positive, and obviously there's equally a lot of negative aspects as well. Now, Germany, as an example, has recently, or is in the process, I'm not 100% sure whether it's been done, declaring esport as being a sport. And there's a lot of arguments in favor for it. But if you look maybe at the more traditionalist international federations or national Olympic committees, so far we're slightly a little bit afraid of calling esport a sport, especially when we then think about League of Legends or Call of Duty or other sorts of gaming that do not necessarily have anything to do with sports itself, but are more around other kinds of images and visions that don't necessarily match the values of sport, or at least as we think they are. So the industry, in any case, what I want to say is evolving, and it will ask us to adjust ourselves, and therefore it will also create challenges in the future on how we integrate new definitions of sports into our structures, how we manage those, how we govern those. And if you look simply at esports, it's a multi-billion-dollar business that is growing day by day. Now, we've seen a little bit of history. We've seen a little bit of the context, the general context. We've gone through the sport in terms of what we've done from a technical side in improving, and we're still improving. Things are getting better and better. Athletes will get better and better because technology is getting better and better. We've seen a little bit what the industry does, moving the goalposts for everyone, for the athletes, but also for the organizations. And of course, then the last one is to understand, if we want to look in the future, how we function, why we function in a certain way. Now, Manuel has used Jean-Lou's favored diagram on how sports and how the actors and the stakeholders are connected to each other. So I did not want to infringe on any copyrights, and therefore I did not use it. But obviously, being in Europe, what we traditionally know is the very common pyramid of sport. We start from the bottom, the athletes, they get together in clubs. Clubs at some point organize themselves regionally, nationally, and at the end they ask to become member of an international body. 100 years ago, the international body was formed first with very little, few national bodies. Today, most of the international federations, at least those that are Olympic, and in the summer in particular, winter is a little bit different because of geographic conditions and climatological conditions. But of course, we're talking now about international federations that have a range between 150 up to 220 national federations as members if you go to the most popular federations. And at the top, the International Olympic Committee. Now there's a little bit of a parallel pyramid which is similar, at least at some point, with the National Olympic Committees, in the fact that every single country has a National Olympic Committee, and every national federation, that is at least in the Olympic Games, is a member of that particular National Olympic Committee. So the base still remains the same. It's simply that at some point you're a member of both the National Olympic Committee and of an international federation. Now that is the structure of the European model, most commonly known, also because most of the things were born in Europe. But there's a different structure as well. And a different structure that is pushing very much in the globalization of today, is pushing its own values throughout the globe and beyond the boundaries of the country of the United States. The American model is obviously totally different. It's not based on clubs that you form with volunteers and things, but it is based on the fact that the athletes come out from high school, colleges, so somebody else is producing them. And then on top of that, you do have professional leagues or professional individual sports. They're organized differently. A league has a commissioner, a board of governors. The owners are the board of governors. They appoint the commissioner, or they hire a commissioner and appoint him, and he's the boss. He can even sanction owners of their teams. And then you have rules and regulations which are not dissimilar to what we would have in international federations. When you have professional individual sports, that's totally different. Those, like golf or tennis, they're run by a players' association. They don't have a board of governors. I mean, they do, but they're the same athletes. They don't have a commissioner. They organize themselves in a totally different way. So that model has its main ground or reasons for existing is totally different. The European model is we want competition. We were made for competition. We want to see Real Madrid beating Liverpool, or the other way around, depending from where you stand from. We want to see competition. What the sports organizations in the United States want to see is a return on investment. And the owners of the leagues, they have a commercial imperative. The second is that when you then look at league, I'm coming obviously from a team sport, then we here want to see promotion relegation. We want to see a link between grassroots and the very top, which is, for example, one of the key points that we are in absolute disagreement with private entities or private organizations in Europe. In the United States, they're mainly closed. There's no reason. It's a franchise system, and there is no up and down in that particular system. The same, therefore, is for them that international competitions for us are very important. We like to see Switzerland on the shirt, or whatever, France, or whoever it is, playing against Italy or whatever. And we'll be sitting there and watching the Football World Cup as much as we may maybe not like football, but we'll still be looking at it and cheering for our own country. That's not exactly what people do in the United States. They go to see the NCAA Final Four, they go to see the NBA playoffs, they see NASCAR, they see other things which relate to their moments at school to some extent, or in their proximity with the professional club that they are having a link with. So this tie to the national pride in sports, that's not as strong as we see it in the rest of the world. But it's a very powerful model that is pushing the boundaries everywhere else in Europe, but also everywhere else, and I'll get back to that. Now, just to make the point, there's a lot of people that talk about this European sports model versus the American model. Obviously, given that there are competitive and promoters that are pushing for the American model, they're pushing for breaking the monopoly of federations, breaking rules and boundaries in order to have a better return on their investments. The European Parliament, as recently as last year, has clearly addressed this issue, saying it is important to maintain the European sports model. That's a value for us in Europe. Equally good governance is important, equally accessibility for everyone is important, and diversity, and equally integrity, meaning corruptions, manipulation of the games, doping, and all these methods need to be tackled to maintain the nature of sport, which is not just business. For Europe, sport is more than business. Sport is social values coupled with business, and therefore, but cannot be treated just purely as another industry that is out there purely profit-driven. The same, as recently as a couple of weeks ago, the sports ministers, and here you have a quote of the French sport minister that equally, again, says, we're not the United States, we are Europe, and we want to maintain the European sports model. And for us, what happens at national level is absolutely important. Now, when you look at the international federation, that's probably too small to see. Those are all the summer Olympic International Federation that will participate in Tokyo in 2020. And as you see, the first one is gymnastics, which was established in 1881 and was present at the first Olympic Games in 1896. And you have a few that now, for the very first time, will be participating in Tokyo, and therefore you see 2020 on the second column. That's the group of federations that is probably and most likely the most active, with the most global sports, most popular sports around the globe. Now, next to them, and these are those that will be in Tokyo, next to them there's probably another 60 or so international federations that don't have yet the chance of being in this group. That can be cricket, squash, just to name a few, motorboating, even Formula One with the FIA, or bridge, chess, and others. And by the way, there's a huge debate going on in some of the countries whether bridge or chess are actually sport or not sport, and some governments has taken the opposite decisions in that particular respect. Now, an international federation is kind of a state of its own, has to run a little bit everything. It's not exactly a state, it's a non-governmental organization, to be also very clear, but it does regroup anywhere, as I said earlier, between 180 to 120, whatever. We in FIBA, we have 213 members right now, and I believe that volleyball is probably the largest one with about 220 countries or members. I mean, countries might be not exactly the correct wording. As you may know, in the United Nations, there are less than 200. So there's a few of those, like Scotland, Wales, England, that are considered members, but are part of the United Kingdom, just to give you an example as how we can have more numbers than those that are currently recognized by the United Nations. We do govern and rule, and I'm not going back to the definition of governing, which comes from Greece, but that's Greek, but that's a long story for another day. The sports, in line with the European sports model, there's one international federation per sport, as much as there is one national federation per sport in every country. We organize, administer competitions. We work on development and promotion together with our members, the national federations. We try, not always very successful, as you've seen from the headlines in the papers, to maintain the integrity of the competitions, whether it is match fixing, corruption, or doping. We try to do this in the best way we can, and as any other corporate environment or industry or even government, we have to change, adjust ourselves, adapt new rules, new standards. What was right yesterday is no longer right tomorrow, or is no longer right today, and has to be adjusted. What is perceived as being right in Switzerland, well, may be perceived as being wrong in China, and vice versa. And so we are in a constant mode for change, and sometimes we're forced to change, and sometimes, fortunately, we're able to change before change is forced upon us. We do have to take care of the being and the well-being of the athletes, obviously also of the spectator that come and watch the games. We need to somehow finance ourselves. We don't have governments as international federations that are willing to support us, as in every country or in many countries, in any case, governments would do with national federations. They would be receiving funds from their governments or from the National Olympic Committee. So we do have to find ways to fund ourselves. The Olympic Games is one way. Selling of rights is another. And of course, we have to deal with technology, which is ever challenging and changing, as well as with media and communication. Now, when you look at the pages that I've highlighted earlier, obviously there's a lot of perceptions out there that if there's a black sheep in the, or if there are few or a lot of black sheep in the Olympic movement, then those are the international federations. They're absolutely lousy, crappy, and they can't do their job properly. Well, if you look at some of the cases, definitely we messed it up. There is no doubt. And when something hurts in one sport, it does affect everyone else. That is equally very clear. So there is a perception that the international federations are poorly managed and that we lack supervision. Obviously, we're kind of an international federation. We're not the United Nations. We don't have the United Nations overseeing us. We have the International Olympic Committee doing some sort of supervision, but that's about it. So our members are supervising us in one way or another, as much as shareholders are supervising their companies when they buy shares of that particular company. Culture, there's a perception that we have grumpy old people that are just trying to get hold of their seats and stay on their seats, and they don't want to give them up to the younger generation. I was fortunate enough to be in a federation where this was absolutely not true. He might have been grumpy, but he was actually quite forward-looking and was very kind to me in any case. I was fortunate to, therefore, to stay and having a chance to becoming the Secretary General of FIBA. But certainly there's a perception that we're a little bit old-fashioned and we're not doing things in a modern way. There's equally a perception that we're not just doing things in a way, but we're inefficient because we are based, and that's historical, it's 100 years of history, on volunteers. And therefore, we do not have professionals that you would have in a corporate company or even to some extent in governments or in public authorities where you hire the people, the mayor gets a salary. Well, that's not the case still in many of our member national federations, and equally, not every international federation has the means to do that for everyone. Now, most of those that you've seen earlier, they do have professional staff, but certainly that has taken years and decades of work, to try to do that. Volunteers is still a huge base, and the world is not going in every corner at the same pace. And without those volunteers, there's not going to be much sport at all, and there will be sport only in a very few countries and in a very few disciplines that are actually very, very much profitable for the market or for broadcasters or sponsors to invest in. But certainly it's a perception that we're inefficient, given some of the also recent history that we have just been able to read in the press. There's obviously other aspects, and I'm gonna leave that out for now, and you have certainly the ability to read them through, and I'm happy to leave the presentation then to Jean-Loup and Emmanuel for distribution if you so wish. So, at the end of the day, a little bit of Latin, where do we go? We move from Greek, we go to Latin. Sport is so old that it will always stay. That's the good thing. That's the good news. I think that, but we're living in disruptive times. There's no doubt. And there's a lot of people that love sport for many reasons, and many for the wrong reasons, because it gives them a lot of publicity to be involved, a lot of publicity to shout, and a lot of publicity to be on the front page of the papers. Nonetheless, whether you're a troublemaker or a troubleshooter, I think it's just part of life. It helps change one way or another. Where it does not help, if you're, however, just simply a troublemaker for the sake of being a troublemaker, then obviously it's sterile and it doesn't bring anything to anyone. If there is a problem, I like that someone comes and complains, but I would also like to hear a solution. If there is no solution, then better don't complain. That's probably as simple as it gets. But what it does feel, and I had the chance of being part of Memo's #1. So, and write a piece on, together with a very dear colleague of mine that is still working also in the sports movement in the IOC, about how, in fact, sport is having a tough time in getting together with the laws of the state. Having had a little bit of a law degree here in Lausanne, it was a little bit of a legal view on that document. And curiously enough, back then already we said, there's a problem. We are, as international federations, and even as IOC or so, we are not-for-profit organizations. And when you look at the pyramid, inside that pyramid, we do have publicly traded companies. big clubs, huge money, they're publicly traded. How do you manage to somehow get a not-for-profit association giving instructions or running or ruling over publicly traded clubs? And how do you fit the regulatory framework from the top down to, and you can impose it? That's a very complicated marriage. And back at the time, we were advocating, although at the end, I think our professor said that you cannot write this because that's too disruptive, that international federations should also become publicly traded companies. So we left it at that, and we stayed with association because that felt a much more safer haven to respect the values of sport. But it's an interesting dilemma that we keep facing all the time. And this is going to be a key dilemma to resolve. The gap between the associative world of the volunteers, of the grassroots, of those that are not able to make money out of making sport, and those that can make money, that's going to become wider and wider and wider. And it is impossible for one structure to control the whole. And that requires, therefore, changes also in international federations as we know them today. At the same time, there's something else, and that's part of the disruption general. Back at the time when you do sport why? Because you want to be with someone. You want to compete against someone. You want to be together. You fight against him or her. After the sport and the competition, what do? You go out, you drink something, you're together, you have fun. Then you go and practice together. Today, this willingness to be together, that's not anymore there. And you say bits and pieces of every single sports environment where people just want to go their own way. I don't like this, I don't follow you. I don't like this. And you suddenly see splits coming not from outside, but coming from inside. And this willingness of being together, somehow we've lost it along the 100 years of history in sports. That's a cycle, as much as there are economical cycles, as much as there are societal cycles, and that's going to come back at some point. Because I think that everybody will realize that if you want to do sports by yourself, that's fine, that's fun, but at some point it's much more fun and much better if you do it with someone else and you figure out how the hell to get over your differences. So interest in sports will not decrease, but we need to change, react. Otherwise, legislators will continue to legislate and private competitors will take over one way or another. Promoters, private leagues, things, they will just come. Money will drive the business one way or another. And we can only convince legislators to keep the eyes on the values of sport, at least under the European model, under the values that we defend, if we are properly and well organized. We should minimize politics, but we need to be close to the base at the same time. And here we are international federations. I'm taking a view which probably, if I were to say this at my own Congress, might not look very politically correct, but at the end of the day, we are as strong as our weakest member. And if our weakest member is involved in difficulties, problems, corruption, things like this, it's a problem for all of us, even if it's 1 out of 213. And therefore, there is maybe a tendency somehow also here to be more involved rather than being not involved even at the national level. And we need to figure out how we work with other people, those that are out there. We cannot just create barriers that we don't want them. That's monopoly. Those will be gone. Whether we like it or not, whether we like the European sports model or not, at some point these monopolies will disappear, at least not maybe in full, but certainly our area or liberty of functioning, as much as liberty is my liberty or my freedom ends where the freedom of my next one starts, if we go back to the very original definition of that, and I think that's going to become smaller and smaller. And if we're not able to tackle that change, we will be having a hell of a difficulty to maintaining these sports organizations at every level all over the place. Therefore, we need to work with these people that are out there, and we need to find the best way, and there are examples. You look at the ITF and the ATP, it works. They didn't choose it, but it works. If you look at the FIA with Formula One, it's a 30-year deal. It works. You can be a regulator and you can have a commercial activity on the side, delegate it to someone, and you're subsidized and you can work on certain things. The same happens in motorcycling, including the same happens in UCI, where private promoters of tours are working within that sector. And I think that's, at the end of the day, we will not have a choice, but this will affect every single one of the sports, at least those where commercial elements will start to become more and more dominant. We do need, obviously, to defend our Olympic values, and I think we cannot sell our soul to anyone, and we need to cherish our athletes and give them the best possible environment in which they can perform. Now, a few examples. Now, of course, allow me, I'll be a little bit parochial. Action and reaction. But sometimes it's better to plan in advance. And if you're able to plan in advance and have a strategic plan and have a very clear idea where you want to go, you can achieve a lot. Not so simple. 213 countries trying to change the structure of FIBA. I can tell you, after an 80-year-old lady to change its habits, that's complicated. Took us 4 years. We've changed. Continents today are subsidiaries of FIBA. They are not separate, independent organizations. The Secretary Generals of the continents are directly reporting to me. They are employees of FIBA. So they are 100% subsidiaries, employees of FIBA. The politics are done at the World Congress, no longer at the Congress in the continents, or no longer at the boards. Anything. We've increased our boards, of course, to make sure that we can have promoters inside, athletes inside, and even have people that come from outside because we don't have all the skills. If it's volunteers that come up the ladder, they have their skills from their life, but we may not have a specialist in commercializations, in finances, in legal risks, or whatsoever. And we made sure that we have a spot for them as well that we can include. That's just one way of tackling, but the key one is that we got rid of this dual matrix. A member country is not anymore a member of the continent and of the International Federation. He's just a member of the International Federation. If you have a dual membership, you get into trouble. And that's a trouble that we create by ourselves. There's not even need for headlines in the newspapers because that's created by ourselves and we cannot complain. We did it ourselves. And if you look at times or at bad times when UEFA and FIFA were not exactly together on philosophical principle, well, that comes exactly from that particular construction of the governance within that federation. So what's the end result then? Now our financial statements are kind of a book like this. I think even the UBS doesn't have it so thick. We have 13 different companies that are currently part of the FIBA ecosystem. FIBA has remained an association because we strongly believe that that's the simplest way of acting. But below that, the continents are subsidiaries, even a private league that we have set up and acting as a little bit as a promoter in order to prepare for the future. If the future is more American than European, is a company that we own at 50%. We have a foundation and so forth. And that gives us the flexibility that we need today to be ready for tomorrow. That's the structure. Then, if you remember the points that I've been telling you about the industry, what's the industry saying? And how disruptive it is. It is disruptive that people don't want to go anymore in clubs necessarily. They don't want to be on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday having a license to pay or and then going to. They want to be free when they can do sports. And so you also need to think about doing that. Not just about how you get better in good governance, how you get better in organizing yourself more efficient, but you also have to think how you're going to be ready for the future for your own sport. So 3-on-3 is one answer to it. It caters to those alt athletes. If you have seen maybe the terminology athlete, that's the alternative athletes. That's those that don't want to be in a system. They don't want to be taught or ruled by anyone, by a governing body, by a thing. They find this absolutely inappropriate. It looks like they have to work under the order of their grandfathers and grandmothers. So that's not what they want. They want to be free, and that's one answer. And the second one is that most of the people that are organizing 3-on-3 are private people. They're doing it for money. It can be a sponsor, it can be a telecom, it can be a university, they're doing this on weekends, on year out, year in, and that forces an international federation like ours, our own national federations, to find a path to work with private people. That's much more important even than the 3-on-3 in itself. The cultural shift in the international federation can also be achieved if you think in this strategic way and act accordingly. Then this I added, I haven't seen now, Emmanuel, your slide, so I just wanted to respond to the slide that in the draft was in your presentation. And I wanted just to highlight that with the governance task force, there's been a lot of progress since 2015 in international federations. As if you remember at the beginning, this came out from the scandals in the FIFA, in the IAAF, and many more. So there's been a hard push by the Summer Olympic Association of the Summer Olympic Federations to say, well, we need to put benchmarks. We need to understand who's doing what, how, and try to measure them against clear benchmark of what is good and what is not good. And here you see at least some bits and pieces of things that have been analyzed in February 2018. First of all, term limits. It's already more than half that have term limits. Published financial, it's 2/3, it's 3/4, sorry. 2/3 and more have a strategic plan, and almost more than 80% have an ethics commission. Now, there was another chapter, which is whether the president receives some money or not. That was not asked, so we cannot give you a particular answer. But in his chart, it was 19% yes, and I believe, or something like 18% versus 82 or something like that. And that brings me back to the point that at the end of the day, we will not have a choice, but we have to professionalize our structure more and more. And over time, the headquarters of the international federations will be fully professional. The corporate culture will take over from the volunteering culture, but of course, at the same time, we can't really forget that the world is not just Europe, and it's not just the United States. The volunteers are all over the place, and we need them every single day, whether it's the mom that brings the kids to the game or to whatever it is doing, or whether it's just simply a secretary general of a national federation of Sambo that is having his office in his car in Nepal. We need the guy. Without him, there won't be Sambo in that particular country. And that would be absolutely disastrous if we were to force professionalization through that one. So that's all that I had for you. I wanted to thank you for your time. Where do we go? I believe that the future is not coming. It has already arrived. And thank you very much for your patience.